In this video, I will show you how to build a coil pot. So in a previous video, I showed you how to create the base for your coil pot using your templates. So you want to make sure that you've watched that video first and that you have your base template cut out with your name on it. Also in that video, we talked about rolling out a slab for the base using the slab roller and then cutting our base with a rough cut and wrapping it with dry paper towel. So my slab has been sitting in my bag with my dry paper towel for a couple of days now. So I just took it out and my my dry paper towel is now damp. So I want to get rid of that and throw it away. I'm not going to reuse that paper towel. I'll just get fresh new paper towel when it's time to clean up today. Okay, so as we're building our coil pots, we'll be working on a banding wheel, but I'm not quite ready for my banding wheel yet. So I'm gonna put this off to the side and I'm gonna start off by just putting down my mat in front of me. So before we can begin building our coil pot, we need to create our base. So right now, my base just is at a rough cut. Before I cut it to template though, I have to compress my slabs. So I have my rubber kidney handy here. You do want to make sure if your tools aren't getting cleaned, if there's any dried clay on your tools at all, make sure that it's clean before you do any of the compressing of your slabs. So I'm going to take a few minutes to compress both sides of my slab. And when I'm doing this, I should have no texture left at all in my slab. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I don't see any air bubbles popping to the surface. If any air bubbles did pop to the surface, I would make sure to insert a pin tool in them to get the air out. Okay, so my slab has been compressed. The next step is to cut to the template. Now, if we're working in class, we're going to work on a banding wheel. If we're working at home, you can create your own turntable kind of with just a piece of paper. So I'm going to do this to show you. So if I had just a piece of scrap paper underneath my workspace, I could turn my paper, which is going to rotate my slab, okay? If we're working in class, we're gonna work on a banding wheel. Your banding wheel that you're working with in class will be a little bit different than mine. Okay, but it's very similar, it does the same thing. Now I don't want to just put my clay directly onto my banding wheel or it's going to stick as I do this. So I want to make sure that I put something underneath. So you could either put your piece of fabric that I gave you underneath, or a piece of paper, or a piece of paper towel. Since I have this piece of paper here, I'm just going to use this. So I'm going to set my slab on top of my piece of paper on my banding wheel. And I want to make sure that my banding wheel has room to spin. So if there were anything cluttering my workspace, I'd want to get those things out of the way. It's going to make it a lot easier to cut a circle if we're able to work on the banding wheel. Okay, so whenever we cut a circle or something curved, we're wanting to use our pin tool. So I'm going to place my base template on top of my slab. And we want to make sure that our name is showing. Okay, so this is going to stay on the bottom of our coil pot starting today so that we know whose is whose. So it's important that we can see your name. Okay, so I have my pin tool here. Your pin tool or your needle tool will work. When we cut, it's really important that we keep our cutting tool straight up and down and not at an angle. So I don't want to angle my cutting tool when I'm cutting. I want it to be straight up and down. I am going to just kind of go slowly here so that you can see as I cut. So I like to start off by starting right up to my circle here. Let's see, wait for you to see. I'll go over here. So I'm going to start right up against my circle, and then I'm going to cut away from it to create like a little cut so that I can pull this piece of slab away, my scraps. And then keeping my pin tool straight up and down, I'll line it up next to my template. And I'm just going to slowly cut and turn my banding wheel kind of at the same time. And I'm going to get like a little bit of a buildup of clay right here up against my tool. So occasionally, if you need to, you can pull your pin tool off to the side and remove a little bit of the clay and clean off your pin tool. And then make sure that you line your pin tool back up the same way that you had it. I'm also making sure to hold down the edges of my template as I do this, so that way I get a nice perfect circle. I don't want you to worry too much about the edges of your circle right now. We're going to be smoothing that out here in just a minute. Okay, so at this point, I have my base cut out. I'm not going to take off my template. I'm going to leave that on there. I'm going to carefully pull this up off of my paper. And I'm going to turn it so that this piece of paper of my template is on my banding wheel. So I'm just going to flip this over. So this way I can slide this around and it's not going to stick. Okay. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, you're going to need your template handy. So here's my template for my coil pot. Always make sure that whenever you're adding coils or using your template, a couple things need to happen. The first is the arrow that's on your template always should be facing upward, okay? So if I were to stand this, the arrow is facing upward because this is the top of my coil pot, okay? The second thing that always needs to happen is the bottom of your template always needs to sit flat on your banding wheel. Now, we have a couple of different sized banding wheels in the classroom. You're each going to be given kind of a medium-sized one, but if you're in need of a larger banding wheel, we do have access to those. You can just ask me and I can help you. All right, so after I have my base slab ready to go, I want to make sure that it's going to follow the shape or the form of my coil pot, okay? So everyone's is going to be a little bit different. We talked a little bit about that in class. This is where my foot is going to be, or my base. So your base is essentially going to act as a foot for your coil pot. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I want to make sure my base and my coil pot are in line together. So I'm going to center my slab, my base slab in the middle of my banding wheel. I'm going to place my template so that it's flat, okay, not at an angle, all right? I don't want it angling at all. It has to be perfectly flat on the banding wheel. And I'm going to use the side of my template to scrape right up to the edge of my base. Now, the bottom of my coil pot is pretty straight, but some of yours might curve in or curve out a little bit more. So you're just going to take the time to do this and keep going around. I'm not pressing really hard. I'm just allowing the template to scrape the edge of my slab. And I want to do this until the edge of my template and the side of my slab are flush. So what that means is there's no gap in between my template and the side of my base. Whenever we're working with our coil pots, another thing to remember is that we always want to be looking at things from all different sides, okay? So as I'm looking to make sure everything's flush, I'm going to line my template up and kind of scoot down a little bit and look at it head on. So I know it's kind of hard to see from the angle I'm working, so I'm going to turn this sideways and see if you can see that better. So here is, if this were sideways, if you could see it this way, if I were to hold my template up to my base, you should be able to see that it is flush with the side of my template. So there's no gap. So we don't want to see like any sort of a gap in between, okay? And it's also going to help smooth this out. Okay, so once you're certain that your base is good and that you're really not scraping too much more clay off, that'll tell you that you're pretty much flush with your template. The next step is to add our first coil, okay? Our first coil will be a hand-rolled coil, and I will show you that in just a minute. Okay, so I have some soft plastic clay here that I'm going to use to roll my coil. And I'm just going to start by wedging it in my hand, warming the clay up a little bit, squishing it around. This is also going to help get rid of some of the air bubbles that might be present in the clay. In a little while, I'm going to be showing you another way of wedging the clay, but for small pieces of clay, this is probably just going to be a little bit easier. Now we're going to roll this coil just like we've rolled other coils that we've attached as a foot to some of our pieces, but instead of using it as a foot, we're going to use it to help us build our walls. So when rolling coils, it's really important that we don't get any sort of dried clay in them. So for this, I would recommend rolling your coils directly on your table. So I'm going to clear up a space off for myself here so I have enough room to work. I'm going to make sure there's no dried clay on my surface. And I'm not going to work on my mat for this because there's probably a lot of dried clay embedded into that mat, and I don't want to get that stuck in my coil. So I'm going to start off squishing my coil, getting it a little bit longer, more like a hot dog form. Once it's oblong like this, the next step is then going to be to roll out our coil. Now, for this assignment, we want our coils to be a little bit thicker than they were for our foot because this project's going to be bigger. So the first coil is the only coil, well, I take that back. We're going to roll 2 coils by hand. And then we have a device in the classroom that I'll show you here in this video in a little bit that will help us to roll coils. So I know everyone will be excited about that because I know how much fun coil rolling can be. But you are going to start off with 1 hand-rolled coil and 1 hand-rolled reinforcement coil. And this is going to show me that you understand how to create a coil. All right, so the difference now between this coil that I'm rolling and one that I would maybe do for a foot on a pinch pot or a foot on a plate, it's going to be a little bit thicker than that. So we want, as a rule, our clay should never be thicker than our thumb. So we want it to be thinner than our thumb. The diameter of the coil should probably be approximately a 1/2 inch. So like from here to here, okay, going across, your coil should be approximately a 1/2 inch. The extruder that we're going to be using that extrudes coils for us is going to make coils that are a 1/2 inch. So we want them to all be pretty similar. So I'm going to roll my coil until it's to a 1/2 inch. And then I'm going to pull my base back over. So this looks pretty good to me. Pretty happy with this coil. It seems like it's going to be long enough to go around my base. So I'm just going to pull this off to the side for a second and bring my banding wheel back in. All right, so anytime we're adding a coil to our coil pot, it's super important that we're also using our template. Okay, so anytime I'm doing anything, if I'm smoothing, if I'm adding on, anything that I'm doing, I need to use my template. Okay, so I think I'm going to pause right now and I'm going to readjust my camera angle so that you can see this a little bit better. Okay, so this seems like a better angle, I think, for me to be showing you this. So I apologize for that. I just want to take a step back just to show you how my template is flush up against all parts of my base. So as I carefully turn my wheel, you can see that there's no gaps. It's right up next to it. So back to what I was saying before, anytime we add on to our coil pot, anytime we're blending or smoothing our coil pot, we always want to make sure that we have our template and that the arrow is pointing upward. So as I attach my first coil, I'm not going to slip and score it yet. I'm going to start off by getting it lined up. Okay, so I'm going to use my template and I'm going to check my template in a few spaces going around because we want these to be symmetrical. So we got to make sure that we're checking it on multiple points going around our coil pot. So I'm just going to take a minute to show you that. So I'm taking my coil and I'm pressing it so that it's touching the edge of my template. Okay, so I'm going to check it like every ½ inch or so, and I'm going to adjust the coil according to it touching my template. And I want to be very careful that there are no gaps in between. Okay, so you can kind of put the coil on there, get it on there first, and then go back and adjust. And when we attach these, we're going to cut them the same way we did for our foot. So, all right, so once I have it on there, it might make it a little bit easier. So I'm just pushing out the coil so that it's touching the edge of my template. And in some places, I'm going to have to push in because that coil was sticking off a little bit too much. So it's important, especially for this first coil, that we readjust as we go. Okay, so when I get to where my coils overlap, I want to be careful because my coil pot, the template that I chose is starting to like bow outward, okay? And as I'm stacking coils on top of each other, they're going to go out and then they're going to start coming back in. But I want to make sure that this first coil, where they overlap, okay, because this top part's going to be cut away, I want to make sure that it is just perpendicular or stacked directly on top of my coil below. I guess that would be parallel. So it's in line. Let me hold it from the side so you can see. It's in line with the coil underneath it, and it's no longer touching the template because, again, this top coil part is going to be cut off, okay? So after I've gone through and adjusted, and I like to take the time to just go back and check one more time. And I know this seems like a lot of work going around and checking your coils, but if you don't do this and as these get taller, they're going to get thrown off. The symmetry is going to get thrown off. And then you'll have to start cutting coils off. So it might take a little bit of time, but it's going to end up saving you time in the future. Okay, so it looks like my coil is pretty good here. I'm going to go ahead and cut my coil. When I cut my coil, especially for this first one, I don't want to cut it on top of my base. So I don't want to cut into my base. So I'm just going to carefully remove my coil, keeping it exactly how I had it. Just going to move this out of the way so we can just see my coil. All right, now when I cut my coil, just like we did as for a foot, I'm going to be cutting through where the coil is overlapping itself. For this one, I'm going to use my fettling knife, and I'm going to cut it like at an angle. I'm cutting down through both coils, all the way down through, and then I'm going to carefully, I like to hold my coil so it doesn't move its shape, pull my knife out, and then I might actually use these extra pieces for my reinforcement coils, so I'm going to put them off to the side but keep them handy. Okay, so your first coil should look about something like this. So before I attach this though, I'm gonna check one more time to make sure that my coil is lined up well. So I'm gonna place this back onto my base, get my template back out. Just make sure there's no gaps anywhere. I want to tell you at this point, the most common mistake that people make when they're doing their coil pot, from what I've determined, is that they're not holding their template perpendicular or flat on the banding wheel. If your template's turning, or even if it's like off the edge of the banding wheel like this, your pot is no longer going to be vertical. Okay, so it's going to throw off its symmetry and it's going to make it too heavy. So make sure that that template is always flat on your banding wheel. Okay, so mine looks pretty good. At this point, I'm ready to attach my coil. So I'm gonna get my wire scoring tool. I have my slip and my slip brush handy here. This over here so you can see. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna start off by scoring where my coil joins to itself. And then I'm also going to score this edge where it's going to attach. And you do want to make sure you're scoring the clay really well. There should be a lot of texture when you're scoring. All right, and then I'm going to also score my coil. Okay, so add the slip in, add enough so that it's filling in your scored marks, but not so much that you're drenching the clay. Make sure you get your seam as well here. So now I'm going to carefully place my coil back onto its base. Create my join here where my coil meets itself. I'm just kind of gently squeezing that together. I don't want to pinch that part where my seam is. One thing to know as we're building these, wherever you have a seam, that's going to be your weakest point. So as we start building these up and as I start adding coils to mine, I want to make sure that I'm not always putting my seam in the same place. So when I add my next coil, I'll probably have my seam maybe over here or slightly off, and then I'll just kind of keep changing the place where my seam is. If I were to put my seam in all of the same place going up, it has a much better chance of creating a surface crack going up and down there, and that's going to be really hard to fix, okay? All right, so I like to let my slip dry just for like a minute or so, just so it's not so wet. And then I'm going to just kind of carefully, you can either use your fingers for this or a modeling tool. I'm just going to use my fingers to blend that seam, just to hide it a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfectly blended yet because we're going to be doing more blending as we go. I just want to make sure my seam isn't going to separate. So I'm going to do the inside also. All right, so we're trying to make it kind of seamless. Okay, so now the next thing I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to use my template. I'm going to make sure that after I attached my coil, that it's still lining up. And if I have to move it before the slip completely dries, you can kind of adjust the placement of your coil. All right, so that looks pretty good. I think I am on to the right step. Okay, so we're gonna do, okay, so one other thing really quickly. We're not gonna blend anything yet. We will be blending our coil pots, but we're gonna blend them after every like 2 or 3 coils instead of after every one. A couple reasons why. The clay will have a little bit of a chance to stiffen up. If the clay is really soft, there's a chance you might actually scrape away too much clay and make your walls too thin. And also it's going to save us some time. If we're blending after every coil, it's going to take us a lot longer to complete these, okay? All right, so we're gonna do one more hand rolled coil before I show you the extruder. And I don't know if you can see, but on the inside of mine here, it's pretty rough looking. There is, you can still see like the slip and where I scored. Also, we wanna make sure that our base is sturdy and that it can support the weight of all of the other coils. So we're gonna add only once, this is the only time we're gonna do this on this project, we're gonna add a reinforcement coil to the inside that's going to help make our base more sturdy, and it's going to fill in some of this messy looking stuff on the inside here. So again, I'm gonna move this out of the way, and I had some extra coil here that I had left over. So I'm gonna just squish that back together so that I'm not wasting it. Now this inside or reinforcement coil does not have to be as thick as your first coil that you rolled, okay? So it doesn't have to be as thick. It does need to, you do need to make sure that it goes all the way around, okay? Oops. I'm trying to get in the video and I'm going off the screen. All right, so it just needs to be long enough. I would say make it slightly smaller than the coil that we just rolled for the first one. So this looks pretty good to me. This coil is going to be blended in, so we're actually not going to see it. It's just for attaching purposes. All right, so I'm going to bring my banding wheel back over. Okay, so this is gonna go inside here, inside the seam that we created, all right? So I wanna first measure it and kind of cut it so that it can fit inside of there. So I'm just gonna carefully just kind of place that inside. Okay, so just kind of placed it inside like this. And then once I figure out the size of it, I will carefully pull this out. Now cut. And you can do it at an angle. It's going to be blended in, so this one doesn't matter as much. Just going to plop it back in there, make sure that it fits. That's good. Now I'm going to slip and score. So I already have some scored marks on the inside here, but I'm going to just go and do a little bit more. And I'm also going to score a little bit on the inside of my first coil. So if I hold it like this, you can see. So I want this to fill in all of this area. So I'll also score my coil, the join, and where it's going to attach. Add my slip. And then I'm going to press this back inside. And I'm going to just start by kind of using my fingers to press it in there. Be careful that you don't press too hard because you don't want to push this coil out. So you might want to like cup it with your hand a little bit as you're pressing that coil down. So I'm just pressing the coil into the seam. Okay, so right now I just pressed it in. It's not done. We can still see this coil, and when we're done with it, we don't want to see it at all. Okay, so I'm gonna let my slip dry just for a couple of minutes before I do the next step. It is really important though that your clay is still plastic when you blend. So you'll wanna watch your time if you're working in class, and make sure you're only attaching this if you have time to blend it. All right, so for blending, you're gonna be using a modeling tool. One other thing, as you're working, especially with coils, your hands are gonna start to dry out. So you can kind of see my hands have dried clay. I have a bucket of water, there's spray bottles at your table. Make sure that you keep your hands from drying out. It will help the clay and it will help you. All right, so I like to use the curved end of my modeling tool in not the straight edge. And especially for this project because these are round, okay? So we need a rounded edge. I'm using the side that curves. So like not the side that curves up, but like the rounded side on the bottom. And what I'm gonna do is I'm basically going to split this coil in half. And half of my coil, I'm gonna blend down into, hold this up a little bit. So half of my coil, I'm gonna blend down into the base. The other half of my coil, I'm gonna blend up into my first coil that I did. And as I'm doing this, I'm applying some pressure so that I don't see the coil. So you've gotta make sure you're supporting the walls on the outside. So I'm just going to like cup my hand around my coil pot as I'm doing this, and I'm pulling down, okay, pulling the coil down into the base. And if you have extra clay that's kind of scraping off as you do this, make sure you keep cleaning off your tool. There's paper towels at your table, and it's a good idea just to have a piece of paper towel to wipe your tool off as you're working. Okay, so the first step is done. So I've blended my coil down into the base, but you can see that there's still a gap here. So I still have a little bit of work to do. But before I pull this up to the walls, I'm just gonna go in with my fingers and I'm just gonna kind of blend and smooth the coil out a little bit where I did my blending. All right, so now I'm going to blend my coil upwards to fill in that seam. Okay, this is especially important that you're cupping your work as you do this. Okay, so at this point, I've finished blending in my coil. Bring it closer so you can see. It's still kind of rough looking, and I want to make sure that it's not going to separate from the walls. So I'm going to go in with my rubber kidney, and I'm just going to compress the inside of this just a little bit more. When I do this with my rubber kidney, I'm going to use this end of it right here because it's going to fit a little bit better inside of my base here. And again, I'm going to make sure that my wall coil doesn't start moving. Okay, and then just so you can see, it's looking a lot nicer on the inside. I'm just gonna go in one more time with my fingers, just do some last minute little touch-ups. Now it is important because as these get taller, you are gonna wanna try to get your inside base looking as good as you're able to, because once we start building up, it's gonna be hard to get your hand down inside of there, okay? All right, I'm gonna do one more thing at this point. I'm noticing that my seam here, if you can see, my seam here is starting to show where my coil joined together. So I'm gonna just take a few more minutes to compress that so that it doesn't separate. That looks better. Okay. All right, before we start adding more coils, I'm just gonna go back in with my template again. And I'm going to, again, make sure that everything's lining up. And I'm gonna show you one more thing. So we're gonna scrape again, and I'm gonna scrape it until it's flush again with my template. So again, my template is flat on the banding wheel, not at an angle. And I'm just gonna start scraping and turning my wheel, or if I were working at home, I would be turning my piece of paper, and I'm scraping to get my coil to be in line with my template. Okay, so you can see that some of the clay is starting to build up here, so I'm gonna clean that off as I go. If we leave that clay on there, it's gonna turn bone dry really fast, and then that's gonna get embedded in our project. So we wanna be careful of that. So once I've gone all the way around and I'm really not getting any more clay that's scraping off on my template, that should tell me that I'm back in line with my template. So when I hold it up, you can see that it is flush. There's no gaps in between here. Bring it closer so you can see how it is right in line with my template. Okay. All right, so from here, we're going to be able to use the extruder. So I'm going to pause my video and I'm going to demonstrate how to use the extruder.